Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and gatheringmagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judges Corner with David Green.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Judges Corner. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about triggered abilities. Triggered abilities are kind of like activated abilities or static abilities, except they trigger or go on the stack whenever certain conditions or things happen within the game, trigger them. And when this happens, the abilities will go on the stack at the next available opportunity. Triggered abilities can easily be identified by the following phrases: when, whenever, or at, which will appear usually at the beginning of their text. And a basic triggered ability would be something like Assemble the Legions, triggering at the beginning of an upkeep. So sometimes things can trigger in the middle of something resolving. And when this happens, they trigger, but they don't go on the stack just yet. They're held off until that thing that triggered them finishes resolving and is removed from the stack. Sometimes multiple things can trigger. And when this happens, they're not put on the stack in the order in which they triggered, but rather they're put on the stack in the order in which the player who controls them decides when they would go onto the stack. And then what happens if something triggers for you and then something triggers for me during this time period? When this happens, when all the triggers will go on the stack, they go on the stack in active player, non-active player ordering, in which the active player's triggers will go on the stack first, followed by all the non-active player's triggers. So when we put a trigger on the stack, we follow all the same steps in which we would for casting a spell or activating an ability. We choose any modes, we choose any targets, we mess with the cost, and we total it and pay any costs in any order, if there are any costs, of course. And if we put an ability on the stack that is a triggered ability and it doesn't have a target because there are no legal targets, such as Snapcaster Mage and Ground Seal, then when we go to handle that trigger, nothing happens. It's just simply removed from the stack. So the next thing I want to talk about are a couple of other things that pertain to triggered abilities and some good examples that go hand in hand with them. So sometimes we have things like with Geist of St. Traft and Exalted, where if something were to trigger the Exalted, for example, it triggers when that event occurs, such as when Geist of St. Traft is tapped and declared as an attacker. And because it's attacked, it's triggered Exalted. But the Angel token that's put into play never actually attacks. It's just put into play attacking. So it misses the opportunity to trigger Exalted. So next we have when certain things will be destroyed all at the same time, such as a Blood Artist being destroyed with a couple other creatures under a Day of Judgment. When this happens, the thing that's dying is the Blood Artist, but a bunch of other creatures as well. And it doesn't seem like it would trigger with the Blood Artist dying at the exact same time as all of these creatures, but the Blood Artist is actually able to see in the game that it's dying with a bunch of other creatures. And this is going to trigger it when we look back and see that it died with a bunch of other cards. So each one of those cards dying with it are also going to cause it to trigger, even though they're all dying at the exact same time. So there are a couple of different types of triggered abilities, such as delayed triggers. Delayed triggers are abilities that trigger later on in the game, and they're set up to trigger at a different point in the game, such as Obsidat's or Aetherling's Return from Exile trigger, or a Pact trigger triggering at the beginning of the next upkeep. They set up a delayed trigger, and that delayed trigger triggers later on in the game. There's also another rule for delayed triggers, and that's if the delayed trigger is affecting a particular object, it doesn't care what that object is changed or turned into, as long as that object is still the same object on the battlefield when it goes to handle it, or the same object in the zone it was. For example, a Berserk targeting a creature, and before the Berserk's ability kills it at the end of the turn, that creature becomes a non-creature through Soul Sculptor. When this occurs, Berserk's still going to kill that object at the end of the turn, and that's because it doesn't really care that it was a creature, it only cares that it was a creature when it went to target it. For its delayed trigger, it just gets rid of the object, unless of course that object is a new object by changing zones. So the next type of trigger are state triggers, and those occur when the game state reaches a certain point, such as Dark Depths having 0 counters, or there being no swamps in play with a Bog Serpent. When this occurs, the triggers just happen because the game state is true, and if we stop them by stifling them or trick binding them, they're just going to trigger again because the game state is still true when that ability is countered. And they're going to continue to trigger again and again every single time their ability is stopped, stifled, or countered. Unless, of course, you change the game state to be no longer true for those abilities to trigger. The next type of triggered abilities I want to talk about are mana trigger abilities. Triggered mana abilities are abilities that trigger and produce mana and that don't target. If that happens, it's considered a mana ability and it doesn't use the stack. But there is an exception to this. If it triggers off of another triggered mana ability, then the second and subsequent triggered abilities do actually use the stack, and they're not considered mana abilities. This is because if they were to continuously trigger and then trigger off of each other, it would create an infinite loop that could never be responded to. And that's not very fair. So the next thing I want to talk about is the intervening if clause, which interacts with triggers often, such as with evolve. The intervening if clause is a clause that basically states that if the thing would trigger, it checks to see if the conditions are true when it would trigger. If they're not, then the effect never triggers. And then, when the effect would go to resolve, it checks one more time. If the conditions are not true then the effect that originally triggered does nothing when it tries to go to resolve and is removed from the stack. This is seen in our gate crash video where we talk about the evolve mechanic. The last thing I want to talk about are a couple of triggered abilities that occur with the word may in them, such as Restoration Angel or Angel of Serenity. You have to select any targets that those cards require, but when they go to resolve, you may resolve the triggered ability. For example, let's say we play an Angel of Serenity and we target a couple of creatures in our own graveyard, and then our opponent goes to try to kill it, trying to exile those creatures forever. Well, when the angel dies and the original trigger goes to resolve, we may choose not to exile those cards if we want. So, while it's important to note that triggered abilities seem very similar to their cousins' static and activated abilities, they're also very different. If you were to arrest a creature with extort, it couldn't attack, it couldn't block, it couldn't activate any of its activated abilities, but it still could trigger extort. And that's because extort is a triggered ability, not an activated one. But sometimes triggered abilities are linked to static abilities, such as in the cases of miracles. Miracles have a lot of text that's not exactly written on them, that's in their comprehensive rules text. And that's how we know that there are both a static ability and a triggered ability, even though we don't have any clear identification of those two. And the static ability is when you draw it, reveal it, and the triggered ability is when you reveal it this way, trigger the effect. So this concludes our episode on triggered abilities. Next, we have a video with Toby Elliott, level 5 judge, talking about the new trigger policies.
So the new trigger policy, in short, has 3 rules to it. You aren't allowed to forget your own triggers. That's cheating. You have no obligation to help your opponent with any of his triggers. You do not need to remind him that he's about to miss a trigger, that he's just missed a trigger, anything like that. The big difference here between regular and competitive is if you remember a trigger, most of the time, unless it's no longer relevant or it's incredibly disruptive, the judge is just going to get that trigger. So that matches how players naturally play the game. If you're playing regular REL, you'll be doing stuff and then he'll say, oh, did you take 2 from that stab wound last turn? And the other guy will be like, no, I didn't, and they'll write it down. And that'll match largely what we do. You don't have to help them, but if they do remember the trigger, they're going to likely get it. So if you want to learn more about the new trigger rules, there's a couple of sources. I can put in a shameless plug for my blog here. I do a lot of writing about these policies. Some of it is targeted specifically at players. It's at blogs.magiccjudges.org/telliott, Telliott. So there's a lengthy article up there on the philosophies behind this trigger policy and going through it all and explaining why the various bits are the way they are, if you want the crazy levels of detail. But there's also a brief summary for players, which is just the high level, here's what you need to know to not get in trouble. The other place is obviously the IPG itself, contains the actual rules for mistrigger, and it's about a page long, a little bit less, and goes into detail about the various trigger types and what happens. So if you want to read a detailed description, that's also available.
So if you have any questions, make sure to send them to us at judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. And until next time, at the end of the show, whenever I reach this point, I'm going to tell you to have fun.